The air inside the Moscow Megasport Arena was thin, cold, and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and hostility. It was July 1868, and at the net stood Ekaterina Volkova, the 6'6" Russian middle blocker known as the Siberian Wall, a woman built of cold marble and Soviet-era steel engineering. Towering over her on the other side was Cruz, the 5'4" captain of the Philippines, looking less like an opponent and more like a mascot in the shadow of a skyscraper. Before the match, a reporter asked Volkova about the height difference. She didn't smile. She just looked down her nose, scoffed, and muttered a single word into the microphone that would ignite a national firestorm. Midgets. She promised a quick execution, a training exercises against children. But history has a funny way of humbling giants. What Volkova didn't see from her altitude was the storm brewing on the ground floor. This is a story of the day the midget decided to chop down the beanstalk, proving that if you cannot outjump a giant, you must out-heart them until they are left swinging at air and crying on the court they thought they owned. The Megasport Arena was already unbelievable. 15,000 Russian fans created a deafening wall of sound, a deep, rhythmic chanting that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the small band of Filipino players huddled near their bench. They were already shivering, not just from the sub-zero temperatures outside, but from the frigid reception inside. The massive jumbotron above center court replayed Volkova's midget's comment on a loop, synchronized with guttural laughter from the stands. It wasn't just trash talk. It was psychological warfare designed to make them feel small, weak, and entirely out of place on the world stage. The Filipino players looked at their shoes, trying to block out the noise, their stomachs churning with a toxic mix of fear and humiliation. But before we dive into this incredible story of the ultimate comeback, the undeniable Filipino fighting spirit, and a love for country so strong it can silence any giant, hit the subscribe button now. Turn on notifications so you never miss our stories the second they drop. Also, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. We want to know how far our stories are reaching. Now, let's get into the match. When the Russian team marched onto the court, the ground literally seemed to vibrate. They were uniformly tall, blonde, and terrifyingly stoic, moving with robotic precision. Leading the phalanx was Ekaterina Volkova. Up close, she was even more imposing. Her shoulders were broad, her arms defined with lean muscle, and her eyes were vacant pools of icy blue that refused to acknowledge the existence of her opponents across the net. During the warm-ups, she launched spikes that sounded like thunderclaps, the ball burying itself into the polished wooden floor with violence. Every time she hit, she stared directly at Cruz, the small Filipino libero, a silent promise of the pain to come. The message was clear: you do not belong in this airspace. The referee's whistle for the first set sounded like an execution order. The first 10 minutes were a massacre, exactly as the pundits had predicted. The Russians didn't just play volleyball, they launched an aerial bombardment. Their serves were heavy, diving missiles that nearly knocked the Filipino receivers off their feet. When the Philippines managed to scramble a return, the ball floated towards the net, straight into the waiting arms of Volkova. She didn't even have to jump fully. She just raised her massive arms, a human eclipse blocking out the stadium lights, and swatted the ball straight down. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of the ball hitting the floor on the Philippine side became a monotonous rhythm of defeat. The score ballooned rapidly to 18-5 in favor of Russia. The Philippine team looked like they were drowning in quicksand. They were colliding with each other, diving desperately for balls that were physically unreachable, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The happy spirit they were known for had evaporated, replaced by panic and the grim realization of their physical inferiority. Volkova was laughing openly now. After blocking Cruz's desperate attempt at a drop shot, Volkova turned to her bench and mimicked a too small gesture, lowering her hand to her knee. The arena erupted in laughter. Maria felt the heat rise in her neck, a burning shame that threatened to consume her. The insult was no longer just words. It was a reality. The first set ended 25-11. It wasn't a loss. It was a public humiliation. The Filipino players trudged back to their bench, heads down, refusing to make eye contact with their coach. They felt the weight of millions of Filipinos back home watching on TV, feeling the collective sting of being called midgets on the global stage. The coach didn't draw up tactical plays on his whiteboard. He knew tactics were useless when your spirit was broken. He just looked at them, his face grim. "They think you are insects," he whispered fiercely over the roar of the crowd. "Are you going to let them step on you? Or are you going to bite?" Maria looked up, wiping sweat and tears from her eyes. The shame was evaporating, replaced by something hotter, sharper, pure, unadulterated rage. The second set began with the same oppressive energy. Russia scored the first 3 points effortlessly. Volkova was preening at the net, already thinking about her post-game dinner reservations. But on the fourth point, something shifted in the tectonic plates of the match. A Russian serve came rocketing towards Maria. Instead of flinching, she absorbed the impact with her forearms, a perfect, stable pass to the setter. The setter didn't lob a high ball for Volkova to swat. She shot a low, lightning-fast set to the outside hitter, Maya, who was only 5 feet 6 inches. Maya didn't try to hit over the Russian block. She leaped with explosive energy and aimed deliberately for Volkova's pinky finger. Crack! The ball ricocheted off Volkova's outer hand and flew wildly into the stands. Point Philippines. The small pocket of Filipino overseas workers in the upper deck erupted with a noise disproportionate to their numbers. Volkova looked at her hand, annoyed, as if a mosquito had buzzed too close. She brushed it off as a fluke. But it wasn't a fluke. It was a declaration of war. The Filipinos celebrated that single point like they had won the championship. They huddled in the middle of the court, screaming, chest bumping, their eyes wild. They realized the giant had a weakness. She was slow. She couldn't adjust a massive frame quickly enough for lateral movement. The strategy transformed instantly. The Philippines abandoned the power game. They turned the match into guerrilla warfare. They stopped aiming for the floor and started aiming for elbows, fingertips, and shoulders. They played scrappy volleyball, diving, rolling, keeping impossible balls alive with sheer grit. The rhythm of the game changed from the heavy thud of Russian spikes to the squeak of Filipino sneakers frantically covering every inch of the court. Volkova was starting to get irritated. She was jumping for blocks, only to find the ball had already been tipped over her head or wiped off her forearms. She was expending massive amounts of energy swinging at ghosts. The score in the second set was tight, 20-20. The Russian coach was pacing the sidelines, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple, screaming at his players in rapid-fire Russian. The robotic precision was cracking. Volkova was barking at her teammates, blaming them for bad sets and poor coverage. The frustration was radiating off her like heat waves. On the other side of the net, the Filipinos were smiling. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a predatory grin. They smelled blood. They realized that the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and they were chipping away at the foundation. The pivotal moment of the second set came at 23-23. A long rally ensued, the ball crossing the net 10 times. Bodies were flying across the floor. Finally, Maria Cruz found herself in the back row, ready to attack. Volkova saw the small captain approaching and camped out at the net, her arms raised like the gates of hell, ready to bury her. Maria leaped. In midair, she saw Volkova's immovable block. Instead of swinging full force, Maria performed a delicate roll shot, gently pushing the ball just over Volkova's fingertips. The ball floated agonizingly slowly and landed softly in the dead center of the Russian court, untouched. The arena went completely silent for a heartbeat. Volkova turned around slowly, staring at the ball resting on the varnish. She had been beaten not by power, but by finesse. By a midget. The Philippines took the second set 26-24. The momentum had completely shifted. The Russian fans were murmuring nervously. The narrative was breaking. Volkova walked back to her bench, refusing the water bottle offered to her, her eyes burning with a mixture of fury and confusion. She was a queen of the net, and her castle was being invaded by peasants. Set 3 was a dogfight. Volkova, enraged, returned to the court determined to crush the rebellion through brute force. She started calling for the ball on every play, demanding to restore the natural order. She managed some devastating hits, screaming gutturally with every swing. But for every point she scored, the Philippines answered with 2 quick, chaotic plays that frustrated the tall Russian defenders. The Filipino defense was reading Volkova's shoulders now. They knew where she was going to hit before she even swung. They were digging balls that shouldn't have been humanly possible to save. The physical toll on Volkova was becoming evident by the middle of the third set. Jumping that high, carrying that much frame, requires immense energy. She was breathing heavily, hands on her hips between points, sweat dripping from her blonde ponytail. The relentless pace of the smaller, faster Filipino team was gassing her out. The midgets were running circles around the giant, making her chase shadows. Every time she was late to a block, Maria Cruz would look through the net and offer a small, polite smile that was more insulting than any trash talk. The Philippines won the third set amazingly. They were up 2-1 in the match. The impossible was happening. The Russian coach looked ready to have an aneurysm. He benched 2 starters, but he couldn't bench Volkova. She was their identity. But she was a compromised weapon. Her arrogance had become her liability. She was so desperate to prove her dominance that she was making fundamentally unsound plays, swinging wildly at bad sets, trying to win points with anger rather than skill. The Filipinos were calm, calculated assassins amid the chaos they had created. The fourth set was a desperate last stand for the Russian Empire. The crowd tried to rally, their chant becoming desperate pleas. Russia managed to scrape by, winning the set 25-23, using sheer height advantage on crucial points. It was now 2-2. The match would go to a fifth and final tiebreaker set, a race to 15 points. The tension in the arena was thick enough to choke on. This was no longer a game. It was a referendum on respect. Volkova stood at the service line for the start of the fifth set, her chest heaving, staring across the net at Maria Cruz, who stood ready, unwavering, showing absolutely no fear. The fifth set is where legends are made and egos come to die. It is pure psychological warfare. The Philippines started hot, racing to an 8-5 lead before the team switched sides. Every point felt like a touchdown. The Filipino players were screaming, embracing after every play, fueling themselves with raw emotion. Volkova was silent now. The trash talk had ceased. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of grim desperation. She was watching her reputation crumble point by point. She was being outworked and outplayed by the very people she had dismissed as subhuman competitors. The score tightened to 13-13. 2 points away from glory or disaster. The Russian setter, panicked, defaulted to their only strategy, set the ball high to Volkova. She leaped, her silhouette dominating the skyline above the net. 2 Filipino blockers, Maya and another small outside hitter, jumped with her. They didn't try to block the ball, they just put their hands up as a distraction. Volkova, exhausted and frustrated, tried to blast through them. She mistimed the hit. The ball clipped the very top edge of the net tape, lost all its momentum, and wobbled pathetically before falling back onto the Russian side of the court. Match point Philippines, 14-13. The silence in the Moscow arena was deafening, a stark contrast to the screaming pocket of Filipino fans. Volkova stared at the net, the inanimate object that had just betrayed her. She looked defeated, her shoulders slumped. The giant was teetering. Maria Cruz gathered a team. "One more," she screamed, grabbing their jerseys. "For every time they looked down on us. One more heart." The Philippines were receiving the serve. This was their moment. The Russian serve was cautious, floating over the net. Maria received it perfectly, passing it to the setter. The entire arena expected a set to the outside, but the setter read the room. She saw Volkova anxiously shifting towards a pin. Instead, the setter pulled the ball back and set a quick, low ball right up the middle to Maria Cruz, who had snuck in from the back row. It was a suicide mission, the smallest player attacking the zone of the biggest blocker. Volkova saw Maria coming and reacted on instinct. She planted her feet and exploded upwards, her timing perfect this time. She reached the apex of her jump, her massive hand sealing the net completely. There was nowhere for the ball to go. It was a perfect block setup. Maria was airborne, the ball in front of her, facing the Siberian wall. In that millisecond, the entire match condensed into a single image, Goliath's hands overshadowing David's face. But Maria didn't spike. She didn't try to overpower the wall. In midair, with Volkova's hands inches from her face, Maria stiffened her fingers and performed a joust, a pushing contest right at the plane of the net. Volkova was stronger, but Maria was lower, with better leverage. Maria pushed up and out, aiming for the side of Volkova's hand. The ball squirted sideways off Volkova's pinky finger, traveled parallel to the net, and landed out of bounds on the Philippine side. The referee blew the whistle and pointed to the Philippines. The Russian block had touched it last, and it went out. Point, set, and match to the Philippines. The arena was plunged into shock. It took a second for the reality to register. The giant had fallen. The Filipino players erupted into a primal scream of release, collapsing into a dog pile at center court, tears streaming down their faces in rivers of joy and vindication. They had done the impossible. But the most enduring image of the night was not the celebration. The camera panned to the net. Ekaterina Volkova was still standing there, gripping the mesh, staring at the spot where the final ball had landed. She didn't move. Slowly, her massive shoulders began to shake. The woman made of ice and steel crumbled. She put her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably right on the court. The humiliator was humbled. The Midgets hadn't just beaten her, they had broken her spirit. Her teammates tried to console her, but she shrugged them off, inconsolable in her defeat. She had promised the slaughter and had become the victim. The footage of the crying giant, brought to her knees by the smallest team in the tournament, was beamed instantly around the world. It was a stark, brutal visual lesson in humility. The dinner reservation was forgotten. The trash talk was choked back by tears of shame. In a moment of extraordinary sportsmanship, Maria Cruz disengaged from her celebrating teammates. She walked under the net to the Russian side. The crowd watched, breath held. Maria approached the sobbing giant. She didn't gloat. She didn't gesture. She simply extended a hand and patted Volkova gently on the arm. It was a gesture of pure class, a recognition of the battle. Volkova looked up, mascara running down her face, and saw the midget offering comfort. Volkova hesitated, then slowly took Maria's hand. It wasn't a firm handshake, just a brief moment of connection. But in that moment, Volkova bowed her head slightly. It was an admission, an apology without words. She acknowledged that height wasn't everything. That heart could not be measured with a tape measure. The giant had been schooled by the ant. The post-game press conference was a somber affair for the Russians. A red-eyed Volkova sat slumped in her chair. When a reporter asked her about her pre-game comments, she didn't look up. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They are not midgets. They are giants in spirit. I have never played a team with that much heart. I deeply regret my words. They deserve this victory." The apology was raw and painful, the final nail in the coffin of her arrogance. Back in the Philippines, the country ground to a halt. The victory was more than just a sports win. It was a national statement. People poured into the streets, honking horns, waving flags. The image of Maria Cruz winning a joust against the 6'6" Russian became an instant icon, plastered on billboards and shared millions of times on social media. It became a symbol for every Filipino who had ever been told they were too small, too poor, or not enough. The team returned home as national heroes, but they remained humble, emphasizing that their Puso, heart, was their biggest weapon. They proved that while you might have physical limitations, you should never place limitations on your fighting spirit. They had walked into the lion's den, been insulted and dismissed, and walked out wearing the lion's fur as a coat. The story of the Moscow Miracle remains a legend in volleyball circles. It is a cautionary tale taught to young tall players about the dangers of hubris. And whenever Ekaterina Volkova steps onto a court now, she is different. The sneer is gone. She plays with quiet intensity, forever haunted by the memory of the small brown women who refused to be intimidated, who took her insults and forged them into a weapon that brought the Siberian wall crumbling down.